Once he's gone, we split everything. Those words weren't whispered in grief, but in excitement. My own children, my own flesh and blood. They didn't know I was standing just outside the room, my hand frozen on the doorknob, the weight of their voices pounding in my chest harder than my heartbeat. You raise your kids thinking you're building a foundation of love, loyalty, and respect, only to discover that, for them, you've somehow been reduced to a dollar sign with a pulse. My name is Ronald. I'm 72 years old, a retired architect, widowed for almost 15 years. I thought my greatest challenge in my later years would be loneliness or the occasional ache in my knees, not betrayal. But betrayal came like a knife in the back, sharp and cold, and it didn't come from strangers. It came from the two people I had sacrificed everything for. That night was supposed to be just a quiet evening, okay? I was in my study, reading, when I heard voices coming from the kitchen. My son, Michael, and my daughter, Claire, didn't know I was home. I had taken an early walk and returned quietly. Wasn't eavesdropping at first, at least that's what I told myself. But then I heard my name in that sentence. Once he's gone, we split everything. There was a light laugh from Michael, and Claire's voice chimed in, saying something about how they'd have to be patient, but it wouldn't be too long now. I felt my knees almost give out. These were the same kids I had stayed up with when they had fevers, the same ones I had worked double shifts for, the same ones I had held when they cried over their first heartbreaks. I didn't want to hear more, but I couldn't move. I stood there, listening to them discuss my estate like vultures circling a carcass. Michael mentioned selling the house immediately. Dad doesn't need all this space anyway. He said. Dan. Claire laughed again, saying something about how she'd take the beach property because she deserved something nice after putting up with my stubbornness. It was surreal. They weren't talking about me like a father. They were talking about me like a problem that needed solving and a jackpot waiting to be cashed. When I finally managed to walk away without being noticed, I went straight to my bedroom, shut the door, and sat there in the dark. My mind spun through decades of memories, holidays, birthdays, scraped knees, college graduations, and every single one felt tainted now. I thought about my will. At the time, it left everything to them. Everything. I'd never even considered another option. Why would I? They were my children. But now, their words had cracked something open inside me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that they could so casually talk about my death, as if it were nothing more than a date on a calendar they were impatiently waiting for. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard their voices. Again, I remembered how my late wife Ellen used to tell me that money changes people. She had seen it in her own family growing up, and she had always urged me to raise our kids with humility. I thought we had. I thought I had done enough, but apparently love wasn't enough to keep greed from growing in the cracks. By sunrise, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let them treat me like a countdown clock. And I wasn't going to let them get their hands on everything Ellen and I had worked for without earning it. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I didn't even tell him the whole story at first. I just said, I want to make changes to my will. Big changes. He scheduled me for the following week, and in the meantime, I began to think through every detail. My estate wasn't small between my home, the beach property, my investments, and the retirement savings Ellen and I had built. It was worth more than I'd ever imagined having when I was a young man starting out. But that wealth was never meant to be a prize for whoever could outweigh me. I also started noticing things I hadn't before. The way Michael had been visiting a little more often lately, always making casual comments about the house being too big for me. Claire would ask about my health, not in a concerned tone, but almost as if she were taking notes. These little behaviors that I'd once brushed off now looked different in the shadow of what I'd overheard. I kept my mouth shut though. I didn't want them to know I knew, not yet, When I sat down with my lawyer, I explained everything. I told him exactly what I'd heard, word for word, and I could see the shock on his face. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Ronald, I've seen this before. You're not the first parent this has happened to, and you won't be the last." It was a cold comfort, but he listened carefully as I laid out my plan. I wanted my will changed so that the majority of my estate would go to someone who truly valued what it represented. Someone who would honor it, not see it as a payday. That someone was my niece, Sarah. She was the daughter of my late sister, and she had always been kind and respectful toward me. She never asked for anything. In fact, she had been the one checking in on me regularly since Ellen passed, just to make sure I was okay. She lived modestly, worked hard as a teacher, and had never once treated me like I was a burden or a bank account. I decided that Sarah would inherit the mansion and a significant portion of my investments. The rest would go to charity specifically, causes that Ellen had cared about deeply. The lawyer raised an eyebrow and asked, "Do you want to tell your children about this change?" I thought about it for a moment and then shook my head. "Not yet," I said. "I'll let them find out in their own time." But deep down, I knew that when they did find out, it wouldn't be in the way they expected. Over the next few weeks, I went about life as usual on the surface. Michael and Claire kept visiting, still smiling, still acting as though they were, playing the role of caring children, even played along, making them think I was none the wiser. But inside, I felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve. Sadness, because I knew I'd never see them the same way again. Resolve, because I wasn't going to let them think they'd already won. The day I signed the updated will, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't that I wanted to punish them. It was that I wanted to protect myself, my legacy, and the love and labor Ellen and I had poured into building this life. They might see it as betrayal when they eventually learned the truth, but I saw it as justice. I saw it as setting things right. Little did I know, the day they'd find out was coming sooner than I thought. And when it came, their faces would tell me everything I needed to know about who they truly were. And they would finally understand that the man they thought they could outwait had one last move left to make. Asterisk, I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the words echoing in my head like a broken record. Once he's gone, we split everything. I could hear their voices again and again, like a cruel reminder of how wrong I had been about my own children. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, not the faces of my babies, but the faces of two people I barely recognized. People who seemed to be counting down the days until I wasn't here anymore. I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they meant something else. But then, deep down, I knew exactly what they meant. There was no misunderstanding. They were talking about my death and what they'd get from it. When morning came, I didn't feel hungry. My stomach was twisted in knots. Sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of me, staring at the steam rising from it. I could hear them moving around upstairs, their voices drifting down. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I didn't care anymore. My mind was already made up. Something inside me had shifted overnight. The father who would have bent over backward to give them the world was gone. What replaced him was a man who understood that love without respect is just weakness. I thought back to the years I had worked my hands raw for them. I remembered coming home from long shifts at the factory, so tired I could barely stand, but still fixing the leaking faucet or repairing a broken door because my kids needed a home that was always safe and well kept. I thought about the nights I skipped dinner so they could have more food on their plates, all the times I turned down buying something for myself just so they could have new clothes for school. I thought all that would matter, thought it would mean something when I got older. But here I was, 72 years old, being discussed like an obstacle in the way of their payday. I kept my voice steady that morning when they finally came. Downstairs, they greeted me like nothing had happened. "Morning, Dad," one of them said, pouring himself some juice. The other one barely glanced my way, smiled, even though my chest felt tight. "Morning," I replied, like I hadn't heard a thing the night before. It was almost laughable how easy it was to act like everything was fine when your whole world had just cracked in half, but inside was already planning. That afternoon, I called my lawyer, Daniel Dodd. I'd known him for years. He handled my affairs. When my wife passed away, I told him I needed to meet as soon as possible. "It's important," I said, and he could hear something in my voice because he didn't ask questions. We set a time for the next morning. I didn't tell my kids where I was going. I just said I had errands. That night at dinner, I found myself studying them. It's the way they talked about themselves. It's the way they asked about nothing in my life, only about things. They weren't concerned with how I was feeling or what I'd been doing. They were more interested in whether I'd paid off my car or if I still had the savings account Mom and I had worked so hard to build. It was like every conversation with them now had a price tag attached. Later, after they went to bed, I sat in my armchair looking around the house. Every photo, every piece of furniture, every memoriette was all here. I had built this life brick by brick, and the thought that it would just be treated like spoils to be divided after I was gone made me feel sick. The next morning, I drove to Daniel's office. I told him everything. I told him about overhearing, the argument about the exact words they had used. His face hardened, and I could see the disappointment in his eyes. He had met my kids before. He knew how much I had done for them. "Ronald," he said, leaning forward, "you have every right to protect what you've worked for. You're not obligated to leave it to anyone who doesn't respect you." We went over my will in detail, every word, every clause. I made changes, big ones, changes that would ensure my children would not get what they were clearly waiting for. I redirected most of my estate to charities that meant something to me, places where I knew the money would help people who actually needed it. I set aside a portion for a scholarship fund in my wife's name. I even designated a few personal gifts for friends who had stood by me through thick and thin. When Daniel asked if I wanted to leave anything for my kids, I paused. Part of me, the father part, still wanted to give them something, even if they didn't deserve it. But then I thought about those words again, and the coldness in their voices. I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "They've made it clear what I mean to them. Let them live with the consequences." When I left his office, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness, because this wasn't the future I had imagined. Relief, because I knew I had taken back control. They thought they could decide the value of my life, but they had no idea that I was the one holding all the cards. I didn't change my behavior toward them right away. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I kept things normal. I smiled when they talked. I asked about their jobs, their lives, their plans, but I didn't volunteer anything about my own plans. It was almost like a game, now seeing how little they knew about what was coming. One night, about a week later, I overheard them again. This time, they were talking about how old people get lonely and how they needed to keep Dad happy until the time comes. My blood boiled. They weren't just planning for my death. They were managing me like I was some sort of project, keeping me content so they could get their reward at the end. It was disgusting, and yet I stayed calm, because now I had something they didn't. I had the truth of what was in that will, and I knew when the time came, they would be in for the biggest shock of their lives. Asterisk, I sat there in my study, the clock ticking slowly on the wall, the sound echoing in the quiet room. The conversation I had overheard earlier kept replaying. In my head, their voices laced with greed and impatience. Hate was surreal, hearing my own children talk about me like I was just an obstacle in the way of their payday. I thought about the years I had spent raising them, the sacrifices I made, the nights I stayed up worrying about them. I thought about the scraped knees, the school plays, the family vacations, the way I had always been there when they needed me, and now this was how they saw me, a bank account waiting to be emptied. The weight of that reality pressed heavily on my chest. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, wondering where I had gone wrong. Was it something in how I raised them? Did I make life too easy for them? Or had the world just hardened them into people I no longer recognized? 4 days after, I kept my distance. I spoke to them when necessary, smiled when I had to, but the warmth was gone. It felt strange. This new layer between us, a thin but impenetrable wall that I knew would never come down. They didn't notice, or maybe they did, but didn't care. Life in the house went on as usual, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. I found myself watching them more closely, how they spoke, how they treated others, what their eyes did when they thought no one was looking. And the more I watched, the more I realized that their conversation wasn't just a passing moment of frustration. It was a truth that had been growing in them for years. One night, for everyone had gone to bed, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat at the kitchen table. The amber liquid swirled in the glass as I thought about what I was going to do. I could confront them, tell them I knew what they had said, but I didn't think it would change anything. They would just deny it, or worse, pretend to be sorry while secretly waiting for me to go. I could change my will again, but I had already done that after the first sign of their greed. No, this needed to be something more than just legal words on paper. This needed to be something that would show them exactly who they had become and what that meant. The idea came to me slowly, like a shadow creeping across the floor. I would give them the chance to prove me wrong, to show me that there was still love left between us. But if they failed, if they continued down this path, they would make sure they understood the consequences of their choices. Over the next few weeks, I began to put my plan in motion. I didn't tell anyone, not even my lawyer at first. I started by quietly meeting with people I trusted, friends from my past, a few former colleagues, even the pastor from the old church I used to attend. I asked them questions, sought advice, listened to their stories about family and betrayal. Every conversation reinforced my decision. This wasn't about revenge. This was about truth. Around the same time, I began to notice how my children treated others outside the family. They were polite when it suited them, charming when they wanted something, but behind closed doors, the masks slipped. My eldest, Matthew, snapped at the cleaning staff for the smallest mistakes. My daughter, Clara, rolled her eyes at neighbors who asked for favors. And my youngest, Eric, seemed to have no patience for anyone who couldn't offer him something in return. It was like they had all inherited the worst traits a person could have, and I couldn't help but wonder how much of that came from me. That thought stung more than anything else. One afternoon, I took a drive to the lake where I used to take them fishing when they were little. The air was crisp, the water calm, and for a moment, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I remembered Matthew holding up his first catch with a grin so wide it nearly split his face. I remembered Clara skipping rocks across the surface while Eric tried to outdo her. Back then, we didn't care about money or possessions. We cared about moments. Realized then that maybe part of the reason I was so hurt was because I missed those days, the days before greed had replaced love. When I returned home, I found the three of them in the living room, huddled together. They stopped talking when they saw me, their expressions guarded. I could feel the distance between us like a physical barrier. I asked them what they were discussing, and Matthew quickly said it was just family matters. I didn't push, but I knew better. That night, I called my lawyer and told him it was time. So we set a date to meet in person, and I started putting everything in order. My new will had already been drafted months ago, but now I added final touches, details that would ensure there was no way for them to contest it. The next week, I invited them all to dinner. I wanted to see if, given the chance, they could put aside their greed and simply enjoy a meal together. I made their favorite dishes, poured the best wine, and tried to recreate the warmth of old family gatherings. For the first hour, it almost worked. We laughed, shared stories, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I had been wrong. But then, as I cleared the dishes, I heard them whispering again. I didn't catch every word, but I heard enough. They were talking about selling the property once I was gone and how they could split the profits. It was like a knife twisting in my chest, and I knew, without a doubt, that they hadn't changed. After they left that night, I sat alone in the dark, the house silent around me. I thought about the man I had been all my life, generous, trusting, perhaps too forgiving. I thought about the lessons I had tried to teach my children and how they had turned away from them. And then I thought about the plan I had put in motion. It was time to see it through. They would never see it coming, and when the truth came out, it would change everything. Asterisk, the days that followed felt heavy, as if the very air in my home had thickened with the weight of truth. I moved slower, not because my body demanded it, but because my heart was learning to carry the disappointment of knowing my own children's intentions. Yet, oddly enough, the sadness that might have broken me years ago instead gave me a strange clarity. I stopped wondering if I'd misunderstood them, or if maybe I was being overly sensitive. I had heard the words with my own ears. I had seen the glances they shared, the way they brushed off my presence in conversations, and I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that if I didn't take control of my own future, simply be swept aside the moment I became inconvenient. It's strange, really, how quickly trust can evaporate when reality shows its teeth. These were the children I had raised, fed, and loved. The days that followed felt heavy, as if the very air in my home had thickened with the weight of truth. I moved slower, not because my body demanded it, but because my heart was learning to carry the disappointment of knowing my own children's intentions. Yet, oddly enough, the sadness that might have broken me years ago instead gave me a strange clarity. I stopped wondering if I'd misunderstood them or if maybe I was being overly sensitive. I had heard the words with my own ears. I had seen the glances they shared, the way they brushed off my presence in conversations, and I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that if I didn't take control of my own future, I'd simply be swept aside the moment I became inconvenient. It's strange, really, how quickly trust can evaporate when reality shows its teeth. These were the children I had raised, fed, and loved. I remembered sitting by their beds when they were sick, staying up late to help them finish projects they had left until the last minute, and taking extra shifts so I could give them the kind of life my parents could never give me. I had thought those moments meant something, but maybe, over the years, they had stopped seeing me as the man who had sacrificed for them, and started seeing me as a hurdle between them and their inheritance. One evening, about a week after overhearing them, I decided to test the waters. I brought up the idea of downsizing, pretending to be curious about simplifying my life. My daughter's eyes lit up so quickly, it was almost impossible to miss. She started talking about how selling the house would be smart and how the money could be invested for me. My son chimed in, agreeing, but in that calculated tone people use when they've been rehearsing their lines. It wasn't about my comfort or my health, but about unlocking the vault they thought they had a claim to. What they didn't know, of course, was that I had already changed my will months ago, before any of this happened. The decision hadn't come from anger back then, it had been more of a quiet realization that the people who would truly value my life's work were not necessarily bound to me by blood. I had chosen people who had stood by me without asking for anything in return. Friends, neighbors, even a young couple who had helped me countless times without expecting payment. Those were the people I wanted to leave something behind for. Still, back then, I thought I might reconsider if my children showed me genuine care. That chance was gone now, but there was something in me that didn't just want to leave things as they were. No, I wanted them to know, not just after I was gone, but while I was still here, that the man they thought they could manipulate was not so easily fooled. I started planning quietly. My days looked the same to them, but inside my mind, I was laying out every move like a chess game. I met with my lawyer again, this time to fine-tune the details. I didn't want there to be any loopholes, any possible way they could contest what I had decided. We sat in his office for hours, going over each line of the document until it was airtight. My lawyer, a sharp and no-nonsense man named Harris, looked at me across his desk and said, "You're sure about this, Ronald?" "Canned, without hesitation," I said, "more sure than I've ever been about anything." The hardest part was pretending around my kids. I still had dinners with them. I still let them come over and talk as if they cared about how I was doing. But every word they spoke now had a shadow behind it, and I could hear the ticking clock in my head, counting down to the moment they would realize the truth. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to host a small gathering at my house. One invited my closest friends, a few neighbors, and yes, my children too. They came, of course, thinking it was one of my usual attempts to bring everyone together. What they didn't know was that this gathering was the beginning of their lesson. I watched as they mingled, as my daughter made polite small talk and my son kept glancing at his phone. They had no idea that the very people laughing with me in the kitchen, the ones they barely paid attention to, were the same people I'd entrusted with everything they assumed was theirs. As the evening went on, I couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of sadness and satisfaction. Sadness for the father I used to be, the one who would have done anything to make his kids happy. Satisfaction for the man I had become, the one who had finally realized that love without respect is just a trap. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my armchair by the window, the house quiet around me. I thought about how life has a way of revealing the truth when you least expect it. Sometimes it's in a sentence you weren't meant to hear. Sometimes it's in the way people look at you when they think you're no longer useful. But sometimes it's in the silence that follows when you stop giving and start protecting what's yours. I knew the next phase was coming soon. It's the moment they would learn exactly what I had done. And while a part of me dreaded the confrontation, another part of me welcomed it, because this wasn't just about money. This was about finally standing up for myself, even if it meant standing alone. Asterisk, I sat in my chair that night, the lamp throwing a faint circle of light over the old carpet, my hands resting on the armrests, steady but heavy with the weight of what I had decided. The house was quiet, yet in my mind I could still hear their voices, sharp and greedy, cutting through the air like knives. Once he's gone, we split everything. That sentence would never leave me. I knew now that the people I had loved the most, the ones I had raised, the ones I had dreamed would carry my legacy with love and respect, saw me only as an obstacle between them and my possessions. I thought about the changes I had made to my will months earlier, the changes they knew nothing about. It was almost poetic how they would one day realize they had been fighting for nothing, that their greed had blinded them completely. The following days, I went about life as if nothing had changed. I had breakfast with them when they visited, asked about their work, listened to stories about their children. They spoke to me with strained politeness, but I could see it in their eyes. They were counting down the days, just waiting for the moment I wasn't around anymore. I would smile, nod, and keep my voice calm, while inside I was memorizing every word, every fake laugh, every forced hug. It wasn't anger that drove me anymore. It was a deep sadness mixed with a strange kind of peace. I knew I had already taken control of the ending to this story. I began spending more time with people who genuinely cared about me. Old friends I hadn't seen in years started to visit after I called them. Neighbors would drop by with pies and warm conversation. Even the young man from down the street, who had always offered to help carry my groceries, began stopping by to mow the lawn without me asking. These were people who didn't want anything from me except my company. Every laugh I shared with them reminded me that family isn't always blood, and blood isn't always family. I realized that the mansion, the land, the investments, all the things my children were so desperate to have, meant nothing compared to moments like these. One evening, I sat with Margaret, an old friend who had been a widow for over a decade. She poured us tea, and we spoke about the past, about our spouses, about the days when our children were small and life felt simpler. I told her what I had overheard that night, and she reached across the table, taking my hand. Ronald, she said softly, sometimes the greatest gift you can give is to protect what you've built from those who don't deserve it. Her words stayed with me long after she left. I realized that my decision wasn't just about revenge, it was about making sure my life's work ended up in hands that would value it. Weeks turned into months, and I kept my secret. The changes to my will remained locked away in a safe deposit box at the bank, only accessible to my lawyer, who was sworn to carry out my wishes without interference. I knew my children would be shocked, maybe even furious, but that no longer mattered to me. What mattered was ensuring that the people who would inherit my estate would use it to create kindness, not division. I had decided that most of what I owned would go to charity, to fund scholarships for children from struggling families, to help build community centers, to give hope to people who would truly appreciate it. A portion would go to a few close friends who had been there for me without expecting anything in return. As for my children, they would get something, but nothing close to what they had imagined. On a quiet Sunday morning, I invited both of them over for brunch. They came, smiling those rehearsed smiles, making small talk as if everything were fine. I served them their favorite dishes, just like I used to when they were kids, and we sat together at the dining table. They talked about their lives, about work, about their plans. Not once did they ask about my health, my happiness, or even if I needed anything. I watched them closely, and I realized that this would likely be the last time we would all sit together in this house as a family. It hurt more than I can put into words, but it also felt necessary. Some things have to be let go, no matter how much you wish they could be different. As they left, I stood at the doorway, watching them walk to their cars. There was no sadness in their goodbyes, just the same polite tone they'd been using for months. I knew they thought they were simply waiting out the clock. They didn't know that the clock had already struck midnight for them in terms of my trust. When their cars disappeared down the road, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of finality. The house was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel lonely. It felt like I had taken back my power. The day I passed away, whenever it would come, I knew the truth would hit them like a tidal wave. They would sit in my lawyer's office, expecting to hear about the division of my wealth, ready to grab their share. But instead, they would learn that most of it had been given away to people and causes that would honor my life's work. Imagined the look on their faces, the disbelief, the anger, the realization that their arguments and plans had all been for nothing. I didn't picture it to gloat, but to remind myself that sometimes justice comes in quiet, calculated ways. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the people you think will be there for you in your final years aren't always the ones who deserve your trust. Sometimes the ones you've loved the most will disappoint you in ways you never thought possible. And sometimes, the greatest act of love for yourself is to protect your legacy from them. My children may never forgive me for what I've done, but I can live for a day knowing that I made the right choice. So, if you're listening to my story right now, take it as a reminder. Pay attention to what people do when they think you're not watching. Listen to the words they say when they think you can't hear them. And never, ever be afraid to take control of your own ending, to get one chance to decide how your story is told. And sometimes, the best ending is the one they never saw coming. And if my story has struck a chord with you, don't just let it fade away, share it, talk about it, and make sure it reaches someone who might need to hear it before it's too late. Because the truth is, you don't always get a second chance to protect what matters most.